Actually, Carolina, I think Felicia is going to do this part. So if you could spotlight her for now, that would be great. Thank you. Hi, Felicia.
Hi there. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. Well, welcome everybody to this event. We're very happy to have our guest speakers. And I'm going to post a little link in the chat to our our current web page, which has a catalog of the past events that we've done over the last couple of years, as well as it's where we announce our upcoming events with links to the upcoming Eventbrites. And then if you're not on our email list, please go ahead and post your email in the chat. Although if you signed up via Eventbrite, you should be added to announcements in the future. And of course, you can always unsubscribe. So the impetus behind this gathering over the last, the gatherings we've had in the last year and a half or so has been, we're calling it Women in Systems Thinking, but behind that is this title, System of Systems Thinkers. And the idea behind that was something like, how can systems thinkers as professionals work together in a way that really takes advantage of the tools we have as systems thinkers to work together? So we have this whole is greater than the sum of the parts sort of aspiration, and yet we witnessed that in the world of systems thinking, we all tend to kind of do our own thing, just like in any other field. And in fact, in some ways, we don't have the mechanisms that other fields have to come together in the way we'd like to see in any case. So we also have tried to attend to sort of bringing the systems language into a realm that's more accessible. There's a lot of jargon in every field, and systems thinking is no exception. Even just the title systems thinking, sometimes it's systems theory, sometimes we talk about complexity. Well, then how does that relate to systems dynamics? And it goes on and on and on. I'm sure you all are familiar with that. So in your conversations today, please be mindful of the jargon that you're using, particularly in any breakout groups we do. And if you're not familiar with a word, feel free to flag it, rather right then to people you're speaking with, or in the chat, so that we can slow down and make sure to include you, because we want to make sure to be inclusive. Is there anything else I should be saying, Carrie?
That's great. Thank you.
Thanks.
So I want to just take a moment now. Thank you, Felicia, and just to reiterate that we're here in conversation with Vanessa Andreotti and her daughter Giovanna, and we are beyond thrilled to have them in this space to continue the line of women in systems thinking dialogues that we've hosted through this conversation series. And we have a really fun-packed agenda for you today, and I can't wait to dive in. However, I would like to invite us all to take a moment to ground ourselves and really arrive in the conversation. So if you're able and willing and interested, you might close your eyes, and I just invite you to find some ground that you can be solid on, whether you're sitting in a chair or standing. Feel free to do either. And I just invite you to consider, what was it that drew you into this conversation today? And if you could imagine what you might like to receive from this conversation and what you are bringing into the conversation, like you just spend a moment to visualize the possibilities, and feel free to take a few deep breaths here. And yeah, I just invite you all to bring all of the energy that you possess into your presence in this conversation and throughout this dialogue today. And now I invite you to open your eyes back up, and here we go. So thank you, Vanessa and Giovanna, for joining us. And I'm going to turn it over to Vanessa to kick us off and to describe her work, just to share a little bit about the title of this session today. This is a very specific title by Vanessa's design, and she's going to get into her work with the Chi DF Collective and describe what that is and what it means, for how we decided to entitle this conversation. So take it away, Vanessa.
Thank you, Carrie. Thank you for inviting me here today. I would like to start with a land acknowledgement. I'm Vanessa Andreotti. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Education of the University of Victoria. And the University of Victoria is located on the lands of the Esquimalt and the Songhees peoples, Lakwangan-speaking peoples. It's also important to acknowledge that the Husainic nation also has a very important relationship with this land. And I am also coming from a mixed heritage background of Guarani and German ancestry. Although in Canada, in this place we call Canada, I identify as a racialized settler who came here married into a Blackfoot and Cree family. But in the Guarani tradition, we have a much longer land acknowledgement that I'm not going to do as a whole, but I will evoke 4 of the recognitions that are in this acknowledgement because they do relate to systems thinking. So the first recognition is the recognition and the acknowledgement of the land as a living entity, not as a property or as a resource. And it's something that we are part of. So that we tend to think about the separation of humans in nature. So this acknowledgement undoes that and sees ourselves as part of the metabolism of the land. The second acknowledgement is the systems, the ancestral systems we are also part of. So this acknowledgement recognizes the ancestors, both past and yet to come. So past, present, and yet to come. And in this sense, I would like to acknowledge that my daughter is also part of the circle that we have today. And in relationship to ancestors, we have different responsibilities. So there's responsibilities of ancestors who have come before us to honor their lives and sacrifices, but also to correct their mistakes and to say that the buck stops here, especially because this is our responsibility to the generations that are currently the incoming generations. In the generations yet to come, we have a responsibility 7 generations from now to guarantee that there is a possibility of life, and not just for human beings, because we are not, our species is not part, is not isolated, is dependent on the life and well-being of other species as well. The third acknowledgement is the acknowledgement of all the violence that has been happening and that has had to happen for us to be here today. So thinking about the minerals that make up the computer and the internet networks that make it possible for the Zoom conversation, we need to understand and remember that this has been mined in conditions of violence to the land, violence to the communities that are the stewards of that land, and that we are complicit, systemically complicit in that violence, and that calls for a responsibility to interrupt it as well. And the last acknowledgement is the acknowledgement of relationships, the fact that we are a huge, enormous family of human and non-human beings, which is also a system, and that this family is currently in distress and dis-ease. So there is a responsibility there also in relationship to healing and well-being. And with that, I would like to acknowledge all the pain that we're facing right now in terms of wars in the Middle East, in Europe, and in Sudan and the Congo. So with that, the presentation is more or less a taster of the work of a collective called the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures Collective. I have a few slides that I will present just as an overview of what we try to do in the area of complexity and systems thinking. We work with a complexity approach to decolonization, which is generally different from the approaches that we see in the mainstream. So I'll start here. Our collective is a transdisciplinary, multi-generational collective of researchers, artists, educators, students, and Indigenous and Afro-descendant knowledge keepers. And we work at the interface of two types of questions. On the one hand, questions related to historical, systemic, and ongoing violence. And on the other hand, questions related to the unsustainability of current modern colonial systems. So we work at the interface of these two sets of questions. The collective brings together concerns related to racism, colonialism, unsustainability, economic instability, wealth disparity, global mental health crisis, climate and biodiversity catastrophes, intensification of social and ecological violence and inequalities, and the likelihood of wider social and ecological collapse in our lifetime. We are engaged in educational and artistic collaborative inquiries and experimentations that build containers for the expansion of our collective capacity and stamina to face difficulty and pain, and to navigate complicity and complexity without feeling overwhelmed, immobilized, demanding quick fixes, or to be rescued from discomfort, and without drowning in the sadness, anger, frustration, guilt, and shame that accompanies these things. So while it's recognized that vulnerabilities are unevenly distributed in this context, in the global context, in our collective, no one is left off the hook. So we have a commitment to moving beyond essentialisms, romanticization, and idealization. So we have a self-implicating critique, even if we are Indigenous, Black, or people of color. And then we work also with loop reciprocity. So any income generated from talks, workshops, and courses is redistributed to a network called T5C. And this is a network of Indigenous communities in Brazil and Peru who inspire and support our work. So because we are called gesturing towards decolonial futures, it's important also to define what we mean by colonization. And generally, when people think about colonization, they think about two things. They think about the occupation of lands and the subjugation of peoples. But our definition is a little bit different. So we look at colonialism as the ontometaphysical. Ontometaphysical is about like how we understand, how we relate to reality. So the ontometaphysical imposed sense of separation between humans and the rest of nature, which creates hierarchies of value, which then is connected to domination and subjugation, and cognitive, affective, and relational neurodegenerative impairments, which we understand as land. If we see land as property, if we occupy land, if we exploit other people, and if we expropriate from the planet, if we create genocides and ecocides, we, in coming from Indigenous communities, this critique is coming from Indigenous communities, we see it as an impairment in our ability to see our relationship with everything else. And it's a neurodegenerative impairment because it is putting us on a path of premature extinction. So instead of seeing like subjugation and occupation as the root of colonialism, we see separability, which is the separation between humans and nature as the root, and this separation then creates subjugation and occupation. So instead of talking about liberation and rematriation, we generally talk much more about accountability. And then here we say that separability manifests as human exceptionalism, anthropocentrism, egocentrism, allochronism, which is seeing the white people as the apex of evolution of a single story of progress, development, and civilization, the idea of land as property, the idea of cultural supremacy, and the idea of understanding identity as grounded in human constructs, which leads to ethnocentrism, universalism, and logocentrism. We can unpack all these words later, but it's important to use the technical specific words for these things that are coming from the literature as well. Now, to unpack these things, I think one of the ways is to understand that this critique coming from this understanding of colonialism is grounded on 4 socially sanctioned denials. So As an educator, if I look at education as a problem of ignorance, what happens is that if I present the information, the problem is solved. Now, if education is grounded on denial, just information is not going to solve the problem. If education is about addressing denials, then we have to bypass the defenses of the ego, and we have to understand a very, very different psychosomatic system of the human being that is not the Cartesian one. So in our analysis, there are 4 denials that are extremely problematic that education doesn't address. It actually reproduces these denials. The first denial is the denial of systemic violence and complicity in harm. The fact that our current systems are subsidized by expropriation and exploitation. They happen at the expense of other people, other species, and of the land. There's also the denial of the limits of the planet, the fact that the planet cannot sustain exponential growth and consumption indefinitely. And I know that you have been familiar with the work of Donella Meadows, so this relates directly to her work here. Then there's the denial of entanglement, our insistence in seeing ourselves as separate from each other and from the land, rather than entangled within a living, wider metabolism that is biointelligent, that is the planet. And 4 is the denial of the magnitude and complexity of the challenges we will need to face together, the tendency to look for simplistic solutions that make us feel and look good, and that may address symptoms, but not the root causes of our collective predicament. So our inquiry, our pedagogical inquiry, also asks very specific questions in relationship to the moment that we're living right now. So the first question is, what if you knew in your skin, flesh and bones, not just in the head, that major, wider social and ecological collapse is inevitably in the horizon, and that in 10 to 20 years or less, what is familiar today will no longer be viable? What if we could collectively respond from a cultural space of emotional serenity or sobriety, relational maturity, intellectual discernment, and intergenerational responsibility, what we call SMDR? What would you or we be doing or be advocating for then? And when the children born today look back 30 years from now, what actions would they be grateful that we took right now? So as part of this inquiry, we have developed several different tools or experiments or invitations for inquiry. But one of the things that we found that was extremely, extremely important in relationship to capability for systems and complexity thinking, and that connects with the SMDR that is in this slide, with the part about discernment, is what we call diffraction. So that discernment equals diffraction. Now, what is diffraction? If we're thinking about light, diffraction is when we can see the different, the rainbow, the prismatic layers of a ray of light. So it's used here metaphorically to talk about multiple moving layers of complexity that we need to hold together. However, what modern education and Western education conditions us to do when we see the multiple layers of complexity is to flatten these layers and impose a narrative of coherence that edits out what we don't want to see and that polices the border. So this is something that is conditioned through universalism and through conditioning desires for certainty, for control, for predictability. So the movement of diffraction it undoes that. It allows us to build the muscles to hold the layers of complexity in view with all the paradoxes, the tensions, the contradictions, without us feeling immobilized or overwhelmed. And this diffraction happens with the self, when we look at the different layers of our own complexity, with reality, when we look at the layers of complexity around us in any room, and with language itself, when we can look at the word and understand that there are multiple different interpretations of what that word means that depend on the context of the interpreter. So I'm going to show two of these tools, two tools of diffraction. One of them is the diffraction of the self, which is a tool called the bus within us. And then another story that I'm going to invite you into an exercise to hear a story while you pay attention to your bus. And the story is about the diffraction of reality. So if we're thinking about the bus, I invite you to see yourself as a bus of different passengers, and these passengers can be all kinds of creatures. If you can't see a bus, it doesn't matter. Any metaphor or any analogy that brings up multiplicity can work, but the bus is really good for different reasons. So in this bus, there's a driver. There are passengers at the front who you know very well. There are passengers in the middle who speak just a few times with you, with the driver. And there are passengers at the back who you may not even know and who may be trying to sabotage the bus. So each passenger is thinking something, might be saying something, and is feeling something. And there is a dynamic within the bus with passengers talking to each other. So we generally, this is a methodology with several layers as well. So we're going to just work with the basics here. We tend to ask, what is each passenger saying, thinking, and feeling? How old are they? Are they speaking from fear or trauma? Do they sound like somebody you know? Do they want things to be black and white? Do they trust the driver? Do they trust you? And then we ask people to observe the dynamics of the bus and to take a step back to think about what they are learning from observing themselves, their different responses to something. And then they share that with each other to create a meta-cognitive language to talk about the complexity within themselves. So what we talk about here is the fact that if you can't hold space or sit with your own complexity, there's zero chance you're going to be able to hold space or sit with the complexity around you. So this tool has been extremely, extremely useful in helping people also to decenter the ego and to disarm, to be able to empathize with each other through complexity. So I'm going to invite you to do an exercise that uses the bus as a tool to hear a story. I'm going to be telling you a story, and then I invite you to watch your bus and see the different parts of you that are responding to the story, and to acknowledge that there's just not just one response. There are many responses, and that we're not just this coherent, flattened Cartesian being. We are multi-layered and very multidimensional as well with our bus passengers. So I will ask you to listen to the story that I'm going to tell you, observing the bus, and then I'm going to invite you to join a breakout room with 3 or 2 other people, and you will then be invited to talk about the different responses you see on your bus, or you are going to be invited to talk about how's the bus going. So the bus metaphor can also be stretched for us to talk about whether the bus is going on a straight line, is caught in a roundabout, has fallen into a ditch. What's the climate inside the bus? What's the weather outside the bus? Are people getting along? Are people trying to burn the bus? These kinds of stretching of the metaphor are extremely important to talk about learning, because they're using a different part of the brain to process cognitively and effectively what's going on within you in your response to the story. So here's the story. This is the story of the house that modernity built, and it's also a story of diffraction that supports the diffraction of reality. So the house modernity built has four frames of the story, four parts of the story. The first part of the story talks about a house that exceeds the limits of the planet. So there's a house sitting on a planet, and this house exceeds the limit of the planet. The foundation of the house is a foundation of separation, separability, separation between humans and the rest of nature. This separation creates hierarchies of value between species, between cultures, between people. Then there are two carrying walls. The first carrying wall is the carrying wall of the modern nation state. And we tend to think that the modern nation state is there to protect people, but the history of the modern nation state is that it was created to protect property and property owners. And when we think about rights like human rights, labor rights, indigenous rights, civil rights, and we look at the history of these rights, critical race theory also shows that the state, the modern nation state, dispenses rights only when there is interest convergence between protecting the interest of capital and the interests of people. So when there is no interest convergence, there is cancellation of rights, which is what some of what we are seeing right now as well. Then on the other carrying wall is the carrying wall of universal reason. So universal reason is a single story that is promoted as a single story of progress, development, and human civilization. And this single story has the power to kill other stories because it wants to be hegemonic. It wants to be the only story that is possible. So we generally say that it causes epistemicides. It kills other stories. Then we have the roof of global capital, which today is a roof of speculative shareholder algorithmic capitalism that is structurally compromised. The second frame of the story is the story of how this house, of the dynamics within the house, the systems within the house. And it talks about how the house was created, is subsidized, and maintained by violence. So inside the house, we have unsustainable growth and overconsumption. And then there are two arrows, one arrow of expropriation from the planet into the house, and another arrow of waste disposal of the house into the planet. And then in the planet, we see dispossession, destitution, genocides, and ecocides as well. So these are the hidden costs of the house. Then we have the floors of the house. We have the north of the north, of the penthouse of the house with people with historical discretionary income. Then we have the basement of the house, the south of the south, and people in the middle of the house, the north of the south, where you have the stairs of social mobility. And then we have people in the planet, people like the Hunikui people, indigenous people in the Amazon, who don't want to live in the house, but also who don't want the sewage of the house to be making their lives and livelihoods impossible. So these people are people who see themselves as part of the Amazon forest. They do not want to financialize the forest. They want to live as and continue to fight. They fight to continue to live as part of the forest. So this frame of the house, this frame of the story shows that there is the story of expanding the house to offer middle class for all is a story that reaches the limits of the planet. Our planet cannot sustain the levels of consumption and waste production of even the working class of the global north. And in the last frame, we have the house cracking under the pressure of climate change, economic instability, cancellation of rights, precarity, populism, polarization. So the structural damage of the roof then translates as cracks in the house, where you have social, economic, political crisis, as well as mental health crisis and ecological crisis. And in the planet, we see an increase in violent conflict and mass and forced migration. So at that point, we ask, do we fix the house? Do we replace the house? We build another house? Do we find another planet? Do we learn to live without a house? And generally, we find three kinds of responses here. Three streams of responses. Some people want soft reform of the house, where there is more modernity, same forward, same leadership, small changes, or radical reform, more modernity, different leadership, and larger changes. Or some people think that the house is beyond reform. More modernity is not an option given the violence required and the limits of the planet, and we need something different. And this something different may come only if we actually become present to the collapse of the house itself, and if we learn the lessons from the mistakes of the past in order to only make different mistakes in the future. So that is the story of the House of Modernity. And I asked you to think about your bus and see the different responses that are maybe coming up for you in relationship to the story. And now I'm going to ask Carolina to put everybody in breakout rooms for about 10 minutes. And it's probably going to be 4 people in each room. And I will ask you to divide the time and to talk about the dynamics on your bus. So you can say, for example, there are 3 passengers talking, or there's 1 passenger really activated that wants to say this, and then to try to process together the holding of the story, the collective holding of the story, with all its layers of complexities, all its contradictions, all its paradoxes, without seeking certainty or even accuracy or control of the process. So that's the invitation, but of course, you can always rebel and do something else and see what emerges in your breakout room. So I'll pass it back to Carolina.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. Opening the breakouts now. Enjoy the discussion. Hand it over to Vanessa again.
Welcome back, everyone. I hope the conversations in the breakout rooms were good. So in order to conclude today, I will show just one more of the tools that we have created for approaching decolonization through complexity, and it's called and then after that I'm gonna pass to Giovanna. I'm gonna have a concluding slide around the lessons we've learned about using complexity to approach decolonization, and then I'll pass to Giovanna, my daughter, for her response coming from a different generation. So the tool that I'm going to share with you is called 7 steps back, 7 steps forward or aside. This is a snapshot of the tool. I'm going to put the link to the full text on the chat. This tool emerged from the kinds of conflicts that are always present in climate gatherings, where we're trying to bring different sectors, different people together to talk about the climate and nature emergency. And this is an invitation that for an approach to the problem that allows us to take steps back. So the first part of the tool is about 7 steps back. The second part of the tool is 7 steps forward or aside. So invitation for 7 steps back, starting with stepping back from one's self-image to decenter the ego-logical desires and center the challenge at hand. The second is the step back from one's generational cohort to have a sense of how incoming generations may interpret and experience the challenges differently. The third is stepping back from the universalization of one's social, cultural, economic parameters of normality to understand one's privilege as a loss of perspective and sensibility. Fourth is a step back from the immediate context and time to see the wider social, historical, structural, and systemic patterns. Fifth is stepping back from normalized patterns of problem posing, problem solving, and relationship building to tap what is already viable but unimaginable or unintelligible in the mainstream, what has been called the adjacent possible. Number 6 is stepping back from the elevation of humanity above the rest of nature to consider our metabolic entanglement with the planet and our accountabilities to that entanglement. Number 7 is stepping back from the impulse to find quick fixes in order to expand our capacity not to be immobilized by complexity, complicity, and uncertainty. Then there are the steps forward or aside. First invitation is to step forward or aside with honesty and courage to see what you don't want to see. The second is stepping forward or aside with humility to find strength in openness and vulnerability. Then stepping forward or aside with self-reflexivity so that you can read how you're being read and learn to read the room. 4 is stepping forward or aside with self-discipline to do the work on yourself so that you don't become work for other people. Then 5 is stepping forward or aside with maturity to do what is needed rather than only what you want to do, to become a good elder and a good ancestor for all relations. 6 is stepping forward or aside with expanding discernment and attention, increasing care in proportion to risk. And 7 is stepping forward or aside with adaptability, flexibility, stamina, and resilience for the long haul. And be prepared to fall, to fail, to have your plans shattered, to be stretched, to change course, and to find joy in the struggle itself, rather than in the imagined prize at the end. So what have we learned from applying complexity and systems in the decolonial, in relationship to decolonization? And we generally talk about the fact that we have a decolonial approach to systems and complexity, and we need a complexity and systems approach to decolonization. So what we've learned, we learned that applying this by working at the interface of these two fields, we start to work with change as a non-linear process beyond the dialectical progression of oppression versus liberation. You can see much more of the paradoxes and contradictions of the field. We learned that there are no simple, single, or seamless stories, no universal answers, and no quick fixes. So we address decolonization then as a super wicked challenge. We have a more precise identification of leverage points. We see everything as collective inquiry of experimentation and collectively accountable learning from both success and failure. We also developed this sense of hyper self-reflexivity, where we are constantly asking ourselves, how am I implicated or complicit in the problem? How do I relate to or hold space for my own complexity? And how can I self and co-regulate? So we find more flexibility, more agility, more adaptability, more possibilities for collaboration, and more stamina for the long haul of this work. So to conclude, I'll just put here 3 resources that have been produced as a result of all these experiments. The first one is the Hospicing Modernity book, which I wrote with a different name because I didn't know how this would be landing in academia. And it's full of stories about how I was able to, in education and in my work with the public sector and with civil society, how I was processing the complexities that I encountered. There's also the Moving with Storms report, which is a report on an interdisciplinary program at the University of British Columbia around the climate and nature emergency, where we consciously and mindfully try to apply both decolonization and complexity into a year-long program with 7 different cohorts of people, students, undergrad, grad, scholars, emeriti, artists, and staff. And we also have a course called Facing Human Wrongs, Climate Complexity and Relational Accountability at the University of Victoria that is open to the public. And we've had around 500 people now going through this course. during the pandemic, we used this course to raise funds for the communities in Brazil that were facing also challenges and emergencies. And the course has become a very important landmark, I think, in inviting people to bring these two things together, systems complexity and a commitment to confronting and interrupting colonial desires and investments that are presented as benevolent, but that are harmful in practice. So I'll stop here and I'll invite Giovanna to come in and respond to the presentation, bringing the perspective of a different generation. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Mom, for bringing me in. I'd like to start off also with my land acknowledgement. I'm on the unceded territory of the Musqueam peoples here in what's known as Vancouver. I'm actually on the Musqueam Reserve itself. I'm a guest on their lands and I'm very grateful. I also identify as a racialized settler in here in what we know as Canada. Yeah, this presentation always, I've heard it like a million bajillion times, and every single time it kind of hits differently in my body somewhere. But the best way I think I always describe in terms of how my generation reacts to it is kind of like a train wreck in slow motion. We kind of came in at a time where there wasn't stability to begin with. Even if you look beyond, like, you know, unsustainability, climate change, et cetera, we came in at a time where the internet was becoming more widely known. We came in at a time where telephones were changing into cell phones, where technology was advancing at such a rapid rate that there was no usual or norm for us. We're constantly adapting as we're going. I remember in high school, in elementary school and high school, like the technologies we were given every year was different. So there was kind of no sense of this like status quo, basically. Although there was, but you could very clearly see that it, like, we wanted to adapt, and we wanted to adapt to something bigger, faster, better. And then if you do look at it from the other side, like, as these technologies are developing, it was also very clear that like the change was not stable. People felt unstable, and you could feel it around us. And if you look at it in terms of like the metaphor of the house, it very much felt like we were in a house that was kind of drowned, like flooding, and the water's kind of coming up to our knees, and we were born already with the water at our knees, if that makes sense. Like, it's already falling apart. There's a problem here, and there's water, whereas we didn't really feel like, oh, there was solid ground before. There's already water. So what do we do in this situation? You know, and when I spoke about this last time, I spoke a lot about how like we don't have the same attachments again because we're brought up in this generation of change, but we don't have these attachments to these promises that a lot of the previous generations had. I never in my life have ever considered that maybe I was going to buy a house, because it's always been evident to me that it wasn't going to happen, you know. So I don't have this attachment to a nuclear family the same way that other people might. And again, that can be made connection to my upbringing as well. But in a general consensus for my generation, we don't have the same level of grief as to losing something we never had. The older generations kind of feel like they are losing something, because you are losing, but we aren't losing as much because we never had it to begin with, and what we had we saw kind of change. So at the same time, though, that doesn't mean that we don't have these, you know, kind of attachments to the pleasures of modernity, the privileges of modernity. I always tell my mom this, like, I love designer bags. I'm sorry, I'm very aware of the 4-step land acknowledgement of the Guarani people. Like, I'm my mother's daughter. I have come down from her generation. I am also have ancestral ties with the Guarani people. And I acknowledge all the violence and I see all the violence and I know, but I also am still attached to something like a Michael Kors purse or a Gucci bag or the latest MacBook or, you know, makeup, things like that, that are like small attachments that are again, these privileges of modernity. My car, for example, as well. So it's not like we don't have these attachments and we're ready to get rid of everything and we want change as soon as possible. No. Like modernity still has its claws. We're still born in that house. We're not born outside of it. We're not born in a place where it's changed and we're still there. We're just in this water, and we're the first generation that's kind of trying to learn how to swim. And I think other generations are trying too, but because we were born with the water, we already have a sensibility with it. Whereas, and I think Gen Alpha, even more so than us, they have absolutely no fear. They just go ham with whatever they're doing. They terrify me, if I'm going to be completely honest. But it's also really inspiring to see them not have the same holdbacks that I might have, or that my generation has expressed that we have. So it's interesting to see how they adapt to, if you use the water metaphor, how they're adapting to their water being up to their necks. So they have to learn to come out of the womb already swimming. But yeah, on that note, like I said, it's a train wreck in slow motion, or like this collapse in slow motion, or a flood in slow motion, where we can see it happening. I very much see it. We feel it. And I think that's something not enough people talk about. Like, not everyone might want to actually verbalize or put into words what's happening, but we feel it. And that's something that my whole generation would talk about constantly, is this depression that we get into that we don't understand, this sadness, this wanting to be different, this wanting to, like, not being heard. We feel it in different ways and it manifests itself in different ways, but we feel that our future has been compromised, and it kind of feels like it's up to us to fix it. But it's also like, we didn't make this problem, yet it is our responsibility to fix it. You know, it's a responsibility we all share together in this, because we're all affected by it. But there is, like, it's very contrasting feelings of, you know, this isn't my problem, why should I bother? Let me go drive my car and get my bags. But also, I kind of do want to live and I kind of do want to have resources. And yes, I do have a responsibility to those who are going to come after me. But at the same time, like, man, why do we have to do all this work? You know, it's tough. And I feel like we all have that sentiment, because again, we want those privileges that are so easy to hold on to. You know, we want an easy life, we want this, we want that, but at the same time, it's unsustainable. It's very clear that it's unsustainable, and it's heartbreaking to see people deny that, you know, and see them suffering, because the more you deny it, the more you're going to end up suffering with it. I hope that made sense. It kind of was like, and I tend to do that a little bit. I'm not as eloquent as my mom with this, because I haven't been doing it as long, but I do appreciate being her daughter and being brought up with this information in the background, so I can feel a little bit more prepared to handle and to have that capacity to hold these things, whereas I know a lot of people don't. And that's why I wanted to join the collective, and I wanted to do this work with her, so that I can also allow other people to kind of create that capacity for themselves. And especially my generation, I like to help them find their voice with this as well, instead of just feeling, you know. But yeah, that's kind of where I come from, if that makes sense. There's a hand up. Do I respond to it? I don't know what to do.
So there are a number of questions in the chat, and I know, Vanessa, we're going to move into another exercise. So I guess there's a question about, Giovanna, whether you're able to stay, hopefully, and be part of the Q&A after we finish this last exercise. Does that sound good? Okay. Oh, you're on mute.
So Carrie, the exercise is just to put the questions on Slido, because
okay,
with the chat, it was really, really fast, so it's very
Yep.
difficult to identify the questions.
Of course.
On Slido, you can actually vote the questions up. So we have a few, how many minutes do we have left for questions?
Well, we have 27 minutes total for the session. And yeah, and then I think, did you have, when we chatted beforehand, you had a question about I wonder. Did you want to feature that prompt as well?
Sure. So,
Okay.
okay, so we will take 5 minutes to go to Slido and formulate a question, starting with the phrase, I wonder. And the exercise basically is to be able to hold the questions together without the impulse, the immediate impulse to respond to everything. So that when we come back to looking at the questions and holding them together, we can allow the emergence, what's emerging from holding the questions to be guiding our conversation. So 5 minutes, we're going to go to Slido and put the questions there. And I think Carolina has a song for us too. Thank you.
Yes, I'm gonna play some music.
Thank you very much for all your questions. I think one thing that feels right at the moment is to go back to the original inquiry that I shared in the presentation, which is about what would we be doing if we knew in the bones and the skin that major change is coming, wider social and ecological collapse is coming, and realizing that for us to be here today, for us to have the privilege to be here today, collapse is already happening in other places and has happened for a long time in terms of indigenous peoples having their lands stolen and other species being driven to extinction and all of that. So generally, when we talk about social and ecological collapse, people think it's coming, but it's already here. And when we talk about that with the people in the Amazon we work with, the Hunikui people, they also remind us that because we are not separated from the land and from each other, what happens is that both in our bodies and in our unconscious, we're already feeling everything. So, and this goes to basically physical things like microplastics in placentas, but also if people are suffering and if the land is suffering, if other species are suffering, our unconscious is picking it up. And we're feeling that pain and we're trying to repress it and we're trying to numb to the pain. One thing that Giovanna told me in a very difficult period in high school, where there was a lot of, in her age group, a lot of anxiety, depression, and self-harm, and even suicidal ideation, was that she was feeling a pain that looked like a phantom limb pain, that it's a pain that is there but not there. And we took this question to indigenous elders in the family and also in other communities we work with in Brazil. And what they told us was that the individualized heart, it drowns in the sadness and anger sometimes of the pain. So for us, basically for us to hold collective pain, we need to remember how to collectivize our hearts, because this pain needs to be felt. We need to feel things. We need whatever is there. We talk about in the project, in the collective, we talk about shit composting, literal and metaphorical shit composting, which means turning something into soil, right? Again, so that something else can grow from it. In the shit composting, learning to compost shit and finding joy in the shit composting is super important, and it involves holding space for processing pain without being dragged and drowning in it. So we have to feel what we need to feel. There's no question about it. And the more we run away from it, the more we are haunted by it. And then that's where the anxiety and the dysfunction and dysregulation happens, right? So figuring out this thing that I said in the beginning, how to expand our collective capacity to hold space for what's difficult and painful without feeling overwhelmed, feeling immobilized, demanding quick fixes or demanding to be rescued from discomfort is the first step in all of this. And this invitation is a huge ask, basically, right? So when I was reading all the questions that are there, that's what came to me. And the idea of also holding space for the good, the bad, the ugly, and the broken, and the messed up of humanity, both within myself and around me, and not escape the difficulty into an idealization that makes me feel better, but that really doesn't it doesn't make me feel connected in the processing of all of that, the cognitive, emotional, and relational processing that needs to happen, the shit composting, right, of all of this. So I'll pass to Gio. And Gio, if you want to pick up the top questions and start there, you can also do that.
Okay. I wonder how to maintain the complexity of these issues while telling stories in a way that resonates broadly. That is, well, that is a huge part of what we're trying to do. Kind of finding ways to both, explain these complexities, but we can't really explain them without having people have that capacity to hold them. They are big things, and a lot of them come in big words, but I always like to think about it like how, if it's a big word that's hard to understand, we need to be able to receive it, and I think, not to, promote ourselves, but one thing is we have the Facing Human Wrongs course that is our attempt at, trying to help people build those capacities while trying to engage with some of these complexities. But I really found, as a facilitator for that course for the past however many cycles, it really, like, I can sit someone down and try to explain these complexities in the most simple and broad terms that I can, and it will land you can grasp that understanding, but you can't grasp that understanding, if that makes sense. It's you can't hold it. I literally imagine it like I used to do a lot of bodybuilding, and you don't have the muscles to hold it yet, and you can literally imagine it as a big word to hold or a big issue to hold, and you don't have the muscles to carry it in a way that's going to be healthy for your body or healthy for you. So you need to also understand how to let that sit first. You need to build up those muscles, the mental or the physical or the emotional, and the emotional. That's how I interpret that. But it is the question, at least for me. It is one that resonates very deeply with me, because it's something I have to do, and something I really want to do, especially for my generation and those coming after me, so because they don't have that same level of knowledge, or we haven't sat, or those who aren't even in academia who don't understand the terminology quite yet, right? We want to make it as accessible as possible. But what do you have to say, Mom? Did you put in the Facing Human Wrongs in the chat?
I did. And I love the fact that you are you're one of the facilitators. We have several, but right now it's closed. The registrations are closed, but they will open up again for the courses in January. It's a 6-week course, and we ask people to suspend their desires for quick fixes, for hope, for immediate resolution, and also for community. For 6 weeks, you learn to build community with your boss and with the other non-human community that you have around you. And then after 6 weeks, this suspension is lifted, and you are in a much better space to build relationships grounded on trust, respect, reciprocity, consent, and accountability without projecting all your anxieties and neuroses onto the relationships that you have. But it's very interesting to see how people go through the course. It's a privilege to be able to witness the process of if we say that in the first 3 weeks, we open up cans of worms and we hide the lids. And then in the next 3 weeks, we learn how to put the worms back in the land and let them do the work of composting in the land. Now I have to, it is an emergency because I don't know where my cord is for the computer, and the battery is gonna just shut the computer down. So I will have to go to a different room, find my cord. Giovanna, you're gonna be responsible for staying. So over to you.
Okay, bye, Mom. I'll see you soon. I'm gonna move on to the next question, which I think was very similar. I wonder what stories we might tell to show the beauty on the other side of the collapse. And I think I like this one because it both talks about, this isn't, when we talk about this collapse and everything, we don't talk about a new system. We don't talk about, another solution, because quite frankly, we don't really have one yet. We're trying, but at the same time, it's not about solutions. We can't jump from one quick fix to the next. We really have to sit with, well, what went wrong? What is going wrong? And then we can start to rebuild something. We can assist with the birth of something new without smothering it in the projections of what came before. But as that birth comes, it's just like a child. You can't already put in what you want from that being, right? But I like this because it shows like I think there is beauty in this collapse, to be completely honest with you. I personally, in my generation too, we carry that lack of fear and promises, but it comes with a sense of liberation almost. And I use that term like cautiously. It's not liberation, it's not free, but it's a sense of acknowledging that there is something going on, and that this pain that I felt, the phantom limb one that my mom talked about, is real, and that I'm not gaslighting myself, and that I'm capable of much more than whatever box that I was supposed to be put into, and that my being is much more than a box that I was put into is beautiful. There is much more beyond the modernity that we built. I think it is very constraining. While it does allow a lot of privileges and comforts and whatnot, it is constraining to a lot of people. It's not very accessible. It's not very inclusive. And I say that it is a joke, but it also isn't a joke because it's true. So there is something really beautiful about watching this house kind of come down, and also not trying to build a new one just yet, seeing, okay, what are the pieces? What can I find in the rubble for me beautiful? There's that is what I'm enjoying personally. But again, that comes with a lot of pain, and there's also beauty in pain as well. Beauty in the fact that we went through something. There's beauty in the fact that we're going through this together. There's beauty in grief. There's beauty in finding, resonating with those passengers and those emotions that you might not have connected with before. I always say for the students in my course that when you expand your capacity and your capabilities, you're expanding your range of emotions, you're expanding your sensitivity too. So there's both sides get built. Oh, it's your red wall. Nice. But you feel more on both sides. You are sensitive to more, and you're sensitive to more grief and pain, but you're also sensitive to more joy and elation, and there's it comes with everything included. And I'd rather be connected and feel everything than to be numb. And I think we're very used to being numb. Numbing is very prevalent in what we do, because that's how we survive right now. If we were to feel everything without the capacity to hold it, it's going to overwhelm us, it's going to overstimulate us, and it's honestly, it felt like it was killing me. So that's where I come for that. I'm passing it back to my mom now that she's back.
I think there's also a very modernist desire for universalism or universal stories or universal accessibility that is not shared when we're thinking about Indigenous education, for example. Indigenous education, you need to be ready, and you need to have a kind of not only ready to receive, but in the right moment of your stages of your rites of passage also to be able to receive certain knowledge. So I've been working in this field for like a long time, but academically for 25 years. And when I started 25 years ago, talking about confronting colonialism and imperialism, at the time, very, very few people were ready to talk about this. And I was gaslighted all the time. But people were saying, is this really happening? Like, who are you to be raising these questions? And I learned that you work with people who are ready. We don't have to, like this impulse to making everything super accessible and grounding people into convincing them of something is not necessarily what education is about too. But it is part of an understanding that a Western understanding that you see the future in front of you, you imagine what it is, and we all get together there. Whereas, for example, a Maori understanding, Indigenous people of Aotearoa, New Zealand, the way I was explained this, and I do say this, having Maori relations in the family, was that the story is that they walk towards the future with their back to the future. The future is there and on your back because the future is woven by what you're weaving in the present, right? So you're weaving the present into the future with other people and other beings. In front of you, you have your ancestors looking at you, and you have the past. So then the ancestors can see what you're weaving. You can't because you're being woven and you're weaving, but your ancestors can see it. And ancestors are those who have come before, but also those who are yet to come, because it's a cycle, right? So they look at what you're weaving and they can tell you if the future that you're weaving or the present that you're weaving into the future is not so good. So what happens then is that they come to you in dreams, or they access your unconscious so that you can weave differently. But this is not about convincing everybody of anything. It is about engaging people in a process of woven inquiry about what kinds of patterns we're weaving together in the present. In the same way, Chief Ninawaho Nikui from the Amazon says that the future depends less on the images we have in our heads or what we think we know than on the kinds of relationships we are able to create in the present. And what we're able to repair in the present. So the whole question about where do we place hope, hope then is never, like, he is very worried about hope being hijacked by this anticipation of the future rather than it being applied in the possibilities that we have to repair relations and weave relationships differently in the present. But when we talk about these indigenous knowledges, it's also important to talk about all the risks that we have in approaching this through a consumption lens. Because then it becomes we're used to consuming everything. We're conditioned to consume knowledge, critique, relationships, experiences. And unless we can weave a different kind of relationship with Indigenous peoples in the long term, relationship of trust, respect, reciprocity, consent, and accountability, then it becomes this sense of consumption for self-actualization that becomes escape from the difficulties of the realities that we have to face. And that is escapism is also a conditioned response. And we say that too in terms of the New Age movement, trying to work only with the rainbows without working with the shit, for example, right? But the rainbows are necessary, as we've learned. the joy is necessary and the epiphanies to work with this composting process. Otherwise, you really drown in the sadness and anger of it. But a lot of us are conditioned to find the rainbow and just escape from just turn your back to the shit and just go towards the rainbow. And that is a problem too. Yeah, I think that's what came out for me. Giovanna, do you want to choose another question?
Do we have time? I think we only have
We don't have time.
No, sadly, we could stay here all day. And we can talk maybe afterward about how we want to, hold these questions or, maybe respond to them, but I don't want to put that on you either. But there are a lot of beautiful questions. So we are out of time for today. And maybe there will be more conversations in the future, but certainly you've left us so much to begin to process and begin to compost within ourselves. And so from the System of Systems thinkers, we just want to say, just a deep bow of gratitude for your beautiful gifts and your time today, Vanessa and Giovanna. This is going to be one that I'll have to watch and rewatch. And I want to say to all of you who took time to be here today, thank you for being present for what I'm sure were moments of discomfort. That's sort of the exercise here. And so we invite you to really deepen into their shared work going forward. And there's a lot of resources in the chat, and we will be sure to send them to you by way of follow-up as well. And just to say that for this year, the series, this is the punctuation on the series for the year. And just want to preview that we'll likely be having a continuation of this particular series early in the new year, which you'll be hearing more about soon. And then we'll be doing more than likely another series as well next year. And we invite you to catch up on all the conversations that you haven't seen and see the weaving that's possible in each of the sentiments of all the speakers that have come before Vanessa and Giovanna. And with that, I just want to say thank you all and have a wonderful day. And if you'd like to say goodbye or anything in closing, Giovanna and Vanessa, please do.
Thank you for holding space with us today. Thank you, Carrie, for inviting us here too. Thank you.